Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
As the turbulent events unfolded in Bangladesh last week, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus said it was like a second Independence Day for the country. But many were shocked that after Sheikh Hasina fled Dhaka, jubilant protesters were knocking down the statue of the man who gave Bangladesh its first Independence Day, her father, Mujibur Rahman. It leads us to wonder how lasting the founding stories of nations really are. Indians have grown up with a story of how we won independence. We read about the Quit India movement, Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Bose, Bhagat Singh. But politically, it was all about the Congress party. But after the BJP won power in Delhi, many wondered that if that narrative would change. If history is written by winners, would the new winners in Indian politics try to retell the story of how India won independence differently? We are joined by Aditya Mukherjee, retired professor of contemporary Indian history at the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's the author of books like India's Struggle for Independence and India After Independence. Aditya Mukherjee, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're on the cusp of Independence Day in India, but I was struck by, what's been going on in Bangladesh next door. And I thought, many people were mystified by these images of Bangladeshis breaking the statue of their own founding father, Mujibur Rahman. And while people understood the anger against the current regime, people said, why are they still eating their own history? And I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how states try to control the narrative of how we achieved independence.
Yeah, thank you, Sandip, for starting with what's happening in Bangladesh, because it has disturbed us no end. But to take the comparison with India further, our national movement was far longer, far deeper. It's a 100-year-old struggle. It's one of the biggest mass movements in world history. It is not going to be so easy to overturn it, though efforts have been going on for the last 100 years to do so by the RSS, for example, to denigrate the national movement, to deny it, to oppose it and everything. But it would be that easy even today, to destroy a statue of Gandhi or Ambedkar or Nehru, etc. However much they may continue to do so in an underhand manner, removing Nehru from textbooks, or lionizing Godse, or putting Savarkar's photo right bang opposite Gandhiji, but yet I think it is going to be an uphill battle in this country. But what has happened in Bangladesh is really shocking and it's very worrisome.
But I was reading a journalist, I think from AFP, who's covered this issue for a long time. And he said, what we are seeing in Bangladesh is something the Congress in India or the ANC in South Africa have understood the hard way, that you can't keep winning elections by sort of flogging your liberator credentials. Ultimately, young people who were not even around when the independence happened, will want jobs, security, fairer society, end to corruption, all of those kinds of things. And now that India has crossed 75 years of independence, is that even more true here?
I draw exactly the opposite conclusion, that from Bangladesh, it is not the Congress and the ANC that need to learn a lesson. It is the Erdogans and the Modis and the Bolsonaros who need to learn a lesson. That, autocratic behavior, taking all power into your own hands, going against the will of the people for a long time, it doesn't work in the long run. That is not the lesson. I don't think that the other lesson is the lesson to be learned. Because in India, I don't think what is happening is just living off the capital of Gandhiji and Nehru. Far from it. If you look at the Nehruvian period, for example, the making of modern India is when Gandhiji has already been assassinated and his tallest right-hand man, Sardar Patel, is dead in 1950. So Nehru carries it on his own shoulders, and does a whole bunch of things which was not part of the Gandhian thought. When did Gandhi say that you have to industrialize in this manner? And so on and so forth. And I think each one of them after that, I mean, whether it is Indira Gandhi or Rajiv Gandhi, etc., I think it's the propaganda that they are a dynasty and, though I don't see how just the name Gandhi makes them a dynasty.
Yeah.
But anyway,
But they are a dynasty because I remember years ago in 2014, I was covering the elections in Amethi and Rahul Gandhi and Priyanka were supposed to do a roadshow. And the Congress was there and Congress workers, to sort of entertain the crowd before these people showed up, were doing a skit. And the skit was still entirely about the sacrifices of the Nehru Gandhi family for the cause. And I talked to these young people in Amethi, and they were like, their main thing was like, look, we are in Rahul Gandhi's constituency and we still don't have a mall where we can take our girlfriend to. All other cities have it. We don't even have that. So there was a disconnect between that sort of story of sacrifice the Congress workers were telling them over and over again and what these young people wanted.
I can appreciate that. But again, let me give you a counter story that when it comes down to protest, first, let me state the fact that as far as our national movement is concerned, whether our Indian people respond to it or not, the answer to that is what is the state trying to do? First, the state is trying to erase that from the memory of the Indian people. From school textbooks, and every day you pick up your newspaper, the Indian Express, it'll have an article on saying what they are doing to the NCERT textbooks. And the substance of it is to, for example, remove any references to Gandhiji's assassination, bring it down to the minimum, not talk about who assassinated, certainly not talk about why he was assassinated, which was all there in the book. That what was Gandhiji's belief, what did he think of Hindu-Muslim unity and things like that. In school textbooks in Rajasthan under the BJP, for example, they removed the name of Jawaharlal Nehru from a textbook which covered not only pre-independence India, but independent India. So there is this effort. There is actually a website, believe you me, Sandip, called Dismantling Nehru. Just Google it and you will see. It's a huge website. Enormous research has gone into it just to show Nehru down, tell lies about him, demonize him, So this is a project. On the one hand, you valorize the people who are opposed to the national movement, who were, and you try to denigrate. You often try to denigrate by pitting one against the other. What does our tall ministers, including the Prime Minister, do? Put Subhash Bose against Nehru, Gandhi versus Nehru, Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi, as if our national movement was leaders fighting against each other and not the British. Now, this is a project that, as I said, the forces which had nothing to do with the national movement, such as the communal parties, Muslim League, Hindu Mahasabha, RSS, they were part of the British side, the imperialist side, right? So I can understand they're wanting, now they're in power, that they will want to rewrite history and remove that image of Indian nationalism. But has it happened in fact? You as a journalist, when you go down to the ground, get one picture. But we as more from a distance get a somewhat different picture. For example, every time that people have to fight for their right, take the CAA movement. What were the posters they were using? What pictures were there on it? It was Gandhi, it was Bhagat Singh, it was Nehru, it was Ambedkar, and the Constitution of India, which is after all the distillate of the national movement. Every movement, take the environment movement, it starts with Gandhi. Even the left. I mean, that is a thing I would like to point out. The left, which started out as big critics of Gandhi and Nehru, I mean, it is they who created a theory of Gandhiji being a bourgeois mascot and Nehru being the running dog of imperialism, etc. All that is gone. Read the tallest left scholars now, read Irfan Habib, read Prabhat Patnaik, and see what they're talking about. They are re-evaluating our nationalism. So there is an effort by a large section of society, intellectuals, to come back to the national movement because there's lots to learn from it. And certainly from people who fight for justice. And not only India, globally, I think. I would like to emphasize that, Sandeep. Look at all the big mass movements that have happened recently. Look at Tahrir Square, for example. So recent in Egypt. And it's got nothing to do with Hinduism, Gandhi, anything of the matter. And they were distributing in Tahrir Square Jeet Shah's book on Gandhi by the thousands. Learn from what, so that's why I said that it is not going to be that easy to wipe out this entire history of the national movement.
is that the reason why? Because, Gandhi is sort of on a pedestal, like nobody really dares knock him off. So even when somebody valorizes a Godse, the prime minister at least has to make the motions and say this has grieved him deeply, whether or not he punishes that person or not. But he has to say that, which you don't necessarily have to do with Nehru. And I wonder if this project you're talking about, dismantling Nehru, is because Nehru is an easier target as opposed to a Gandhi, but the real target is Gandhi?
Well, without any doubt, I don't think Nehru is an easier target. The reason why Nehru is attacked is because in practice, after Gandhiji's assassination, it was he who took on the battle. And in fact, as Nehru has written, that during the period 46 to 48, it was like a Holocaust-like situation in India. Lakhs dead, 6 million refugees, communal temperature at its highest, the Mahatma assassinated. And Nehru said it is not a madman just who's assassinated one person. It is the act of an organization to undertake a coup. Use this opportunity to bring about a Hindu India as a mirror image of Muslim Pakistan. And what Nehru did was took away this opportunity. He turned the first election into a referendum that do the Indian people want a secular India or do we want a Hindu India like Muslim Pakistan? And 94% of the Indian people voted for a secular India. So, and consistently Nehru took it away from them. So therefore he's one big target. And as you may remember, one BJP leader from Kerala had actually said, it was reported in an RSS journal, that the Godse shot the wrong person. It should have been Nehru. So it is not as an easy target, but Gandhi would be a much more difficult target globally, but so is Nehru.
But when you say that those years, 46 to 48, the India that became independent, it was like a Holocaust-like situation, lakhs dead and all of that. So the historians at that time, what did they see their task in sort of the narrative that they needed to craft? What was the vision they wanted for India to see itself in when it came to as an independent country?
Very good question. In fact, this is the question that Nehru asked the historians in 1948-49. See, this year I happen to be the general president of the Indian History Congress. And because of the demonizing Nehru that is going on, my talk was on Nehru in our past, present, and future. So it was entirely on Nehru. And one of the things I looked at was this: Nehru was a historian. And what did he think of history? And the first thing he says in 1948 or 49 to a group of historians is that how you can go back to your history and draw multiple lessons. And he said, in this situation of the Holocaust-like situation of complete divisive tendencies, you can draw from history many elements which bring people together, as you can bring elements which separate us. Now, the historian's job is to choose which one he is going to bring out in order to build a better future. And I tell you, it is not only the historians, but the intellectuals of the country across the board, from filmmakers, from Raj Kapoor's to, Ravi Shankar's. Everybody took on this Nehruvian project, build a more humane, pro-poor, secular, modern India. That was the project in those days.
But now that's been also one of the criticism, right? That while that was important and maybe even essential at that time when we're coming out of the trauma of it, it has led to a certain whitewashing is the wrong word, but it got like set in stone, as it were. Writers like, I remember Kapil Komireddy saying that it led to a point where we were not honestly dealing with the past, whether it was the price India had actually paid for Muslim invasions or sort of papered over it. And it, in fact, inadvertently, with the best of intentions, ended up creating a more fertile ground for the rise of religious nationalism, which felt like their voices were being deliberately written out of the story.
Again, this is propaganda. This is not what happened. In this particular lecture that Nehru gave, while he said that you must focus on the positives in your past, the uniting, the bonding tendencies of Indian civilization, and he took us back from Mohenjo-daro down through Buddhism, through Guru Nanak, through Akbar, the whole history. I mean, his discovery of India is one of the best histories ever written on India, right? And he said, But that does not mean you glorify your past. You do not look at the warts, you do not analyze those. And I think our historiography in India was one of the best. That is why it is so much under attack. It has never done that. This glorification of the nationalist past is not the Indian historians' project. It is the so-called Hindu nationalists. There is no word called Hindu nationalism, by the way, because in a multi-religious country, if you're Hindu nationalist, you're anti-nationalist. So the word should be Hindu anti-nationalist. That is what Muslim anti-nationalism did, and it did break up the country. It is their project to say that, we could fly ancient India and, or that Ganesh got his nose because of plastic surgery, etc. The tallest of our leaders are saying that. But Indian historians, as a rule, have not done that. As I said, this is again a lie, a propaganda.
But at the same time, what would you say were the stories that became the untold stories of the independence struggle, or rather the ones you wish were better known? And I didn't study history at a college level, so my history knowledge remained at that sort of school level, Bipan Chandra textbooks, maybe at the best. But I remember going to an exhibition for the 75th anniversary. The DAG had an exhibition here about independence, and there were all these stories around the Santhal revolution, or the role of Dalits, women, and stuff. And I felt like I, at least, didn't really know these stories very much. Would you agree, or is it just I wasn't paying enough attention in class?
Like you, I also didn't study history. I was a student of economics, till my master's, in fact. But that apart, it is, again, a notion that Indian historians have only talked of Gandhi Nehru. You mentioned Bipin Chandra's book. Pick up the book, see how many chapters there are on peasant rebellions, see how many chapters there are on tribal rebellions, on the revolutionaries, on the socialists, on the communists, and you will see that this is not true. Since the Indian History Congress was formed in the 1930s as a nationalist, secular, progressive, increasingly left-oriented, but not necessarily, organization. And from the 30s, you have writings on peasant movements in India, A.R. Desai's book. There is so much. There is so much. It is not true. Again, they say that they only talk about North India. Any textbook, class 5 textbook you will pick up, will have so much about the Cholas and this and that and the South India. This is as I said, they're trying to create a memory, which is not there. That what they did was, Indian historians have only valorized Muslim rule. As Nehru said, there is no such thing called as Muslim rule. There were some invaders who happened to be Muslims, who often used Hindu generals to fight other Muslim leaders. So what was the Muslim about it? This is what in the medieval period happened. But they've created this narrative as if, there is a whitewashing away of the ancient past and only a glorification of the medieval past, which is utter rubbish. What they're trying to do is exactly what Pakistan did. In Pakistan, there is no Pakistan history taught anymore. They call it Pakistan studies because they study Mohenjo-daro, etc., because that is in Pakistan. And then they wipe out the whole of the ancient South Asian history because that is quote-unquote Hindu according to them. And it starts with the medieval period. Then they wipe out the national movement altogether because they were not part of it. And it starts with Jinnah. Now we are trying to do the same. The NCRT wipes out 300 years of our history, at the end of the Mughal period, in 1700, India produced 8 times the GDP of United Kingdom. It wasn't that evil, I tell you. It not only was one of the richest economies in the world, it also produced one of the most composite cultures. Some of the best Bhakti and Sufi traditions all emerged in that period, So it is wrong. It is a misrepresentation of how our history has been written or has been understood by our people.
You said the History Congress also becomes increasingly leftist. Was that a problem in your view in the terms of, what was the consequence of that as in terms of history?
See, being left in today's language almost seems like an abuse. Urban Naxal. But why should being left be an abuse? I'm not saying being Stalinist. I didn't say this History Congress become a communist organization. It functioned like Putin or something like that. It functioned like a progressive. By left was meant progressive. By 1930s, Nehru had given up the Stalinist notion of dictatorship of the proletariat. He was one of the first in the world, along with Antonio Gramsci, to say socialism must be socialism of 90%. There is no socialism without democracy. You know, so what is wrong with a socialist ideal which is democratic? You know, and that is what it was. It was the shift we made in history was to try to write people's history. Take out the word left and say that people's history was being written. I'm equally happy. But the fact is that it is the left which took up the initiative to write about the socio-economic, political history of the Indian people, of the poor, of the oppressed. R.S. Sharma, the great, he happened to be a Marxist, but his book was writing about the Shudras in ancient India, which this regime had great trouble with, and they wanted to delete parts where he talked about the caste system. They still believe, they want to argue that caste systems came with Muslim. Ancient India had no caste. Cockable story that they want to spread.
Well, you said one of the things when you're talking about the NCERT textbooks and stuff is chunks get erased, things that are sort of inconvenient to whatever is the current government's worldview. But at the same time, and of course, we've long heard the argument that one of the big problems always with the BJP was that unlike the Congress, it didn't have that pantheon of freedom fighter heroes. So, as you mentioned, they often focus on the disagreements between a Sardar Patel and a Nehru or Subhash Bose and Gandhi and all of that as a way of saying, look at all these people who were sidelined. So in this 10 years that the government has been in charge, how do you see, how much have they been actually able to shift the narrative around independence? Because I feel like you can't just erase. In the end, you also have to replace it with something, insert yourself into that history, as it were. Otherwise, there are just embarrassing gaps.
Yeah, I can't say to what extent they have succeeded in doing so, but the effort definitely is to, for example, why the valorization of Savarkar all of a sudden? After Gandhiji's murder, they stopped talking about Savarkar for about 30 years. Savarkar has been resurrected in the recent past, only in the 90s when they came to power in the center. Because, they want to show some hero. And Savarkar in his youth was a hero. He did do a certain amount of revolutionary act for which he was put in prison. So they want to lionize that. They want to call him Veer Savarkar. The word Veer was added by Savarkar himself in his own autobiography. Nobody called him Veer, but he called himself. Now he's become Veer Savarkar. And they want to erase the fact that he became an apologist. He took a pension from the British. And after being released, all that he did was try to ensure that the national movement was put down. So, but then you can't do it just with one Savarkar. You have to find. That's why this whole thing about unsung heroes of the national movement. They're looking around for unsung heroes who may be from their tribe, but there aren't. That their role has been so negative right through the national movement that one is ashamed. So it is not going to be easy to invent leaders, but in today's world and today's information technology with which you can actually capture the minds of the people, what is possible, you as a journalist know better than me, is horrendous. What happened in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, this massacre that happened, they created this memory of a 14th century battle.
And this is before WhatsApp and all of that.
Yeah, no, this is 90s. This is before WhatsApp, but it is still the 90s, very different from, let's say, the 50s and 60s. So they created this notion of huge oppression by the Muslims and massacre about 7,000 Muslims. In Srebrenica, the graves are still there. And we've seen how the country broke up into 7, 8 by just imagining or creating a memory, even when it did not exist, of oppression. I'll give you an example of how memory creation occurs. Everybody talks about this Somnath temple being destroyed by Mahmud of Ghazni. And as Munje had put it, how it seared the Hindu psyche and, this created this Hindu-Muslim conflict for 1,000 years, etc. And you must have heard several times our Prime Minister giving speeches and talking about 1,000 years of British rule. So this 1,000 years is linked to Somnath's 11th century destruction of the temple, right? Now, a scholar like Romila Thapar said, let me look at it from the sources that what was the impact on Hindu-Muslim, this thing. And what does she find? She's written a whole book on it, highly recommended. She finds that 100 years after the destruction, the temple is again rebuilt by a local king. And when it is rebuilt, there is no mention of Mahmud of Ghazni in any of the records, in any source. 200 years later, in the premises of the temple, properties of the temple, a Muslim trader is allowed to build a mosque with the support of the local priests, local population, and the local Raja. No mention of the Hindu-Muslim psyche being broken. It is in the 19th century, in the British Parliament, where the first time this issue is raised, how the destruction of the temple created a huge divide among the Hindus and Muslims, which was picked up then by the communalists, Hindu communalists, and made into this huge big thing. See, here is memory creation. The people did not think so. They saw it as a local, raider coming and looting a temple and going away, and that was the end of the matter. But 800 years later, you create a memory of Muslim oppression. What is being done today is an attempt to create a memory of Muslim oppression. Unfortunately, there isn't, how much can you hang on to a few of Aurangzeb's activities, to say there was Muslim oppression for 1,000 years in India, and it's rubbish,
Yeah, but I mean, I don't want to go back into the 1,000 years since I wanted to focus on the independence movement. But since you brought up Savarkar, and as you say, like for 30 years, nobody was talking about Savarkar. But let me sort of play devil's advocate here and say, was that a mistake? Because given that Savarkar was an important figure, his ideas hugely influenced a lot of people. And now, of course, they influence contemporary politics enormously, that perhaps instead of erasing him or not talking about him, a more nuanced views of both the pros and cons of a figure like Savarkar was warranted, instead of just reducing him on one side to this apologist who asked for clemency from the British government. So let's dismiss him entirely, to the other side saying, oh, it sort of gives the other side a vacuum in which they can now create this much more glorified, hallowed image of Savarkar, whereas all along scholars, historians could have engaged with the pros and cons of Savarkar and had a more nuanced picture of him existing.
And that is exactly what scholars have done. No scholar worth his salt has tried to erase the fact that Savarkar at one point of time was a nationalist, or that he wrote the India's War of Independence book, which had an influence at that time. Nobody's denied that. But to lionize a person who Sardar Patel himself said as a criminal lawyer, that I have no doubt in my mind that it is an extremist group of Hindu Mahasabha led by Savarkar, which created the plan and saw it through. This is what the Jivanlal Kapoor Commission also said. Now, do you want to make a hero out of such a person who's linked with the assassination of the father of the nation? And that would be a bit stretching it too much. But even then, people haven't done that. Even when we talk about Jinnah, we talk about the fact that the early Jinnah was a nationalist. The early Syed Ahmad Khan was a nationalist. But we also say that what they did later was, Jinnah almost created a fascist movement, as did Savarkar. So that is what the historian's job is to do, not to see a person in black and white, but to bring out all the shades of grey. And I think Indian historians have consistently done that. It's the notion that is this, as I said, this memory creation that is going on. Look at the Ram Temple issue. Even the Prime Minister said, a battle fought for 500 years, we finally won the Ram Temple. Rubbish. Till the 1980s, nobody was talking about Ram Temple. Not Unsung, not BJP, nobody. The Ram Temple again comes in 1858. You know the story. It is the Mahant of Hanuman Gadi, which is a temple right next to the Babri Masjid. He was accused, or the Hanuman Gadi temple was accused of being built on a mosque, that some raiders came and destroyed it and built a temple on the mosque. And the case was going on. And the Mahant thought that the best thing is to create a counter case. So he, not the Babri Masjid, he created the Chabutra, the Ram Chabutra out on that. He said that Ram was born there. Just a counter claim, 58, which is taken up in the 1870s by the British. You see, the role of colonialism is so important. Saying that there is a belief, now it has become a belief that Ram was born here. And that has been drummed up in the 80s as a 500-year-old battle. So here is complete ahistorical stuff. It's got nothing to do with history. Historians don't even know where Ayodhya was. This Ayodhya was named Ayodhya only in the 6th century by a king I'm forgetting his name at the moment, because he wanted to link himself to, everybody wants to link himself to God and to Ram, no? So he named the city, it was called Saket earlier. Balmiki's Ayodhya ran across a different river, and I mean, in any case, it was a poem. It's not history. Now you've created this live human being. The courts are treating him, Lalla as a person. I mean, this is, I don't know what world we are living in.
But when it came to the independence movement, I felt like when I studied the history, it was like this long list of dates and commissions and Simon Commission, Wavell Commission, this plan, that plan, Montague Chelmsford reforms and all of that, which was just like this dizzying thing. But now looking back, as these people are formulating their ideas about what the independence movement is going to be about, like how did this idea of what an independent India should look like start developing? Because I feel like sometimes that got lost to me while I was going through all the dates and commissions.
And that is the reason I gave up history in class 5. Who the hell wants to remember, kings, queens, their names, and, the dates of their wars and who lost and who won, etc., etc. And that is what Nehru says, that is not history. Please don't write history, put life into the dry bones of history by writing about the people and their lives. And that is what the Indian historians have done. What I'm trying to say is you were probably, had to read very bad books, as most children in India have to, where they have to mug up these dates, etc. But that is not what history, that is not what makes the discipline very exciting. And the project of what the idea of India is had started in the 19th century itself, and otherwise it would not motivate millions upon millions of people. When you talked about how do people react to the national movement today, I presume from your name, etc., that you are Bengali, right?
Yes, I am.
And you would probably understand this, that in Bengal, there are still so many songs. For example, Amon Deshti Kothay Khuje Pabe Na Go Tumi, which was songs that was sung in the Swadeshi movement in 1905, 1906, 1907, in that period.
And was just sung in Dhaka a week ago.
Yeah, and they bring goosebumps to you even today. So the ideas of the movement that's why I said one of the greatest mass movements in world history, they had gone deep down into the minds of the people. It is not going to be so easy to uproot and take away the entire cultural impact, just the cultural impact of the Swadeshi movement, of which Tagore and, so many others were spearheading. It is not going to be so easy to take it away.
How did they go so deep down? There was no WhatsApp factory then, clearly.
One example, in Bengal, since you're talking about this, Jatra was a major form, which was used from the 19th century onwards. That entire nationalist Jatras would be created, through that form, through that theatre form, which would travel from village to village to village. They brought nationalist ideas, just as Tilak was able to use the Ganesh festival, to bring nationalist ideas, not to, as it is being used, to create divisive ideas, So this is one way in which it was done. But the primary way, as we have now discovered through our research, is just meetings under the tree, meetings in the little rooms that you had in every village, etc., etc. That's talking to people, meeting people over a long period of time that changed the narrative in the minds of the Indian people, took away the fear.
And so when do we first see Indian scholars, activists, academics really grapple with the idea of the kind of India they were hoping the independence movement would shape? Because it's not enough, as we're seeing in Dhaka right now, it's not enough to throw off the regime you don't like if you don't have necessarily an idea of what should come in its place.
You see, in the colonial period, anybody who tried to write a non-colonial, non-communal history was punished. He would lose his job, where the education system was completely controlled. So bulk of the history that was written in the colonial period was written by the nationalist leaders themselves. Each one of them wrote books. Nehru wrote 3 of them, but so did Gandhi, so did Subhash Bose, so did Tilak. They all wrote books. They brought out their newspapers. Tilak brought out the Maratha, for example. Dadabhai Naroji brought out the Rastguftar, So in regional languages, in English, they brought out newspapers. So journalism played an enormous role in those days in spreading the idea of the vision of the Indian national movement. And, when I was about to say, when I said fear was taken away, I said, the manner in which the national movement comes back, the slogan that Rahul Gandhi is giving these days, Daro mat, darao mat, comes straight out of Gandhiji. And you should read Nehru on what difference Gandhi makes, that where the people were weighed down by fear of the government, fear of the police, fear of authorities, fear of this, fear of poverty, fear of this. And then comes Gandhi and the pall of fear lifts, and he gives the call, do away with fear. So what I'm saying is that inspiration sort of seeps through when people want to fight back, even today.
Would you say then that at that time, because you say all these national leaders are also writing books, that at that time there was in fact a tradition of popular history? Because in modern times, people often complain that India doesn't have enough popular historians. They have academic historians and they have Romila Thapar, but the layperson is not going to pick up Romila Thapar and read her, even though they all know her as a very great historian. But are you saying that at that time that perhaps these people, we don't necessarily think of Bose, Nehru and all these people as historians, but they were writing popular histories?
Sandip, it almost seems that you and I had a private meeting on discussing questions, because this is exactly the question I also asked, and Nehru also asked in 40s when I was writing this. He says that who are the historians writing for? That if please, he says, do not write only of one particular narrow thing that may interest you, unless you are able to connect it with the big picture and present that big picture in a manner that the ordinary person understands. Otherwise, he says, that it is useless. It is just your personal little thing that you're doing and you and your small group of friends. So history must be. This was taken up seriously by all the scholars. Firstly, popular history was being written by the national leaders themselves. And not only history, the challenge to the social sciences came from the Indian nationalists. Again, not very well known, but at least Bipin Chandra was among the first person to point this out. In the 19th century, it is people like the early nationalists, Dadabhai Naroji, Rana Day, etc., who created the world's first comprehensive economic critique of imperialism. Decades before Lenin, decades before Hobson, decades before Rosa Luxemburg, they created a powerful critique. And that is one reason why the moral basis of British rule, that it is Mai Baap Sarkar, it is benevolent, it brings development and modernity, was blown to the skies. Because for 50 years, they demolished it at the popular level, using popular language like the drain theory. Everybody understands the drain, In village meetings, we discovered the drain theory would be explained. It's a very complex idea of how transfer of surplus occurs. But they popularized it and brought it in a simple manner. Each of the tallest scholars that you mentioned have also written popular history. Ramila Thapar has written history for class 6. For 11-year-olds. Satish Chandra, another tall medieval historian, has written for class 8. Vipin Chandra has written for class 10, And all of them also write popular books. Ramila Thapar writes scholarly books and has written popular books, just as Vipin Chandra has written popular books, just as Amartya Sen has written popular books. He writes the argumentative Indian also. And he makes the same arguments in his Idea of Justice, which is a hugely scholarly philosophical work. But he writes it in a popular way. So, these ideas of the national movement, these, as I said, the Nehruvian ideas, did go down and were appropriated by the intelligentsia, the modern intelligentsia, which after independence could write independent history. Each one of them, Irfan Habib has written for the public, popular pamphlets. He brings out a series of called the Popular History of India. Already I think 20 volumes have come out, simply written, meant as textbooks to be read, which are not dates and kings and queens, but the people's history of India as it is called. So there is an effort. Unfortunately, that effort is now being destroyed, just as our education system as a whole is being destroyed, but particularly within it, history education is under huge attack.
So it wouldn't be right to say that William Dalrymple was our first popular historian.
So it would not be right. It would not be right. He is very popular. He writes very well indeed. But so do so many, a whole bunch of, so does Shashi Tharoor, if you are calling that popular history. And as for, if you're talking of history which is slightly fictionalized, whole bunch of people written that kind of history in regional languages, etc.
And there seems to be an enormous market for an appetite for it now. What do you think that's about? Like history books, people writing around like history meant, you see them all over airports now.
Correct. And I'm glad that there is. But unfortunately, a lot of the popular history that is being written, like things written like by Bikram Sampath and others, are, falsifications of history, completely. I wish it was not that. Dalrymple's history is not a falsification of history. It's very good history written in a very interesting way, and catches the people's imagination. I think more of that is necessary, certainly. I'm totally with you on that.
Now, when you mentioned that, this whole project of unsung heroes of Indian independence was a way to, sing yourself into the story, as it were. What, according to you, from your perspective, were indeed some of the unsung heroes of Indian independence, things that you wish you had learnt in history when you were growing up?
You see, as I said, that from the time that after independence, mainly from about the late 50s and 60s, that Indian scholars, many of them happened to be from the left, but not all of them, once they started writing the people's history, then the heroes of the movements began to come up. For example, if you read the story of, let's say, the Bardoli struggle, where it was entirely a peasant movement, where they had to, they were putting their cattle, their lands, everything at stake for a movement which was not only, of which there was no guarantee that they will win. So people have tried to bring in the ordinary people's participation in the movement and the sufferings that they have made. We ourselves have traveled all over the country. We started from Kasargod, the northern end of Kerala, and went district by district up to village by village, virtually up to Cape Comorin, and came up the other way till as much as Kakinada, and Odisha. And then we did Bengal and other parts of the country. We did several thousand hours of interviews with ordinary people. The idea was to get people, the voices of ordinary people into the writing of history. People who participated in the movement. How did a Dalit woman in a village called Pachala Tadipadu in Andhra Pradesh agree to join the Gandhian movement? So we went to the village, we talked to the elders, we managed sometimes to talk to surviving people, because we started this in the 1980s. So people who participated in the 1930 movement, 1942 movement were still alive, many of them. And it was a marvelous story, And we are not the only ones who are doing that. There are a lot of people who are trying to bring in the ordinary people's participation in this great transformation that occurred in the world, the independence of India. In my mind, it was the biggest event of the 20th century, because colonialism after that globally just collapsed once the Brits got thrown out of India, But what made it possible? What were the nuts and bolts of it? Neither Gandhi nor Nehru had any illusion that it was their leadership which did it. Both of them repeatedly write. Gandhiji particularly says that I don't create movements. I only have the capacity to read the people's mind. And when their people's mind is at unrest, I give it a direction. That's all I do. So historians, good historians, have tried to catch what was happening at the grassroots and what role the leadership played in making the movements happen as they did.
In fact, we've actually done a show with P. Sainath talking about some of these freedom fighters that were truly unsung, as in many of them weren't eligible for freedom fighter pensions because their roles didn't match the rule books. But when you talked about the Dalit movement, it occurred to me, and I don't know if it's true, and I just want to ask you, in case if you know about it, I read an essay in a catalogue. It is actually about the 1857 War of Independence, and it says that it was actually triggered by a Dalit woman, an untouchable named Bhangi Matadin Hela, who was refused water by Mangal Pandey and retaliated by saying what happened to his Brahmanism and Hinduism when he bit the cartridges of the Enfield rifle, which were greased with cow or pig fat. That cow or pig fat part I know, but I didn't know the other part. Is that true? Do you know?
I wouldn't know whether this detail is true. Even if it is not true, it is a lovely story. I mean, after all, as I said, history is a lot of myth as well. And I can imagine this mythology also developing, but I have no way of verifying if it is true. I have not read it as a historical fact.
But when you say history is myth, and there is obviously also a movement to make history into science or fact, when you put in a lot of money to establish the places where the wars of Mahabharata happened, or where was Indraprastha and all of these things. Could you counter argue that 75 years on, that maybe we can look at a project of looking at partition or the story of the independence movement in different ways, rather than the ones that we were only used to right after independence?
Without a doubt. You see, firstly, I do not think that history is not a science. History is one of the most complex sciences where the variables are multiple and they are not controllable. It's not like the economist, no, who says that assuming there is no political disturbance, assuming there is no climate change, assuming this, that, and the other, if you increase capital, what will be the impact on labor? Now, that you cannot do with history. You can assume nothing. It's a very complex science. That is why it was called the master discipline, a discipline which incorporates every other disciplines in its explanatory power. It'll have to be a good historian. You'll also have to be a good economist, a good political scientist, good sociologist, good environmentalist, and so on and so on and so forth. So it is a science, number one. Number two, you can establish certain facts and there is a methodology that the science of history uses for establishing facts, how to corroborate, how to seek evidence and to correct the bias, or to at least identify the bias in this evidence, etc., etc. But just as history is a very scientific project, simultaneously, history is a project in which the last word, nobody can claim that they have got the last word. That is, the possibility of an alternate view must always remain. So it is therefore open-ended as well. It is this open-endedness which is often misused, and mythology is presented as fact. As you said, projects to find out where the rivers of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana flowed, when we know that they were written as kavya, as poetry. They were not written as itihasa, as history, or as religion. These were not religious texts. Valmiki's Ramayana was a kavya, But now somebody wants to make it into history, and therefore then you start looking for things in it. As I said, that is not history. But as for the partition, of course, there is so much that happened which is not recorded, or the records are unavailable, or as we now know, are getting destroyed, are not being made available, even when they are available, because they are uncomfortable truths in that period. There was a project called the Towards Freedom Project, which was funded by the ICHR to bring out the documents of the last 10 years of British rule, to show how the transfer of power occurs. It was supposed to be the answer to the transfer of power volumes brought out by England, by the British government. They brought out 5 fat volumes called The Transfer of Power, how the transfer of power occurred. The answer to that, we thought, it was thought in India, led by Sarvapalli Gopal, Radhakrishnan's son, who was the founder of our Center of Historical Studies in JNU, that there must be a project called the Towards Freedom Project, where we will bring out a document that they haven't looked at. They're looking at the Secretary of State files, the Viceroy's papers. We will look at something at the grassroots, right? And multiple volumes came out. Every time the BJP was in power, they stopped the project. Finally, it was completed till 1947 under Sabyasachi Bhattacharya's supervision. And the last volumes, 3 volumes on 1947, all 3 prepared, 2 were published, then the regime change occurred. The 3rd volume has been thrown in the dustbin because they don't want the facts to come out. They don't want the reality to come out. Fires happen in the National Archives and in the offices of various parts, so that files get destroyed. So it is going to be very difficult, especially oral history. As things pass, the value of oral history also becomes less and less and less. There are not too many people who recall that past, who you can use that source. But still, I would agree with you that I think much can be written on the partition itself, and is being written. At the moment, people are, for example, doing memory studies, talking to survivors of partition. On a large scale, there is an entire partition archive that has been created where all these stories of people, ordinary people who didn't speak about the partition for the last 50 years, are now encouraged to speak up about it. So an alternate story is going to emerge, a different aspect which was overlooked, which was only talking about that, what was happening on the top, the major decisions, but what it meant for the man on the street. Writers have written about it, people like Manto and so many others have written about it, Bhisham Sani and others. But historians too need to look into this and look at alternate ways of looking at it. But there must be alternate ways of looking at history. They mustn't be, creating an imaginary version of history. That is what they are. Not alternate versions of history. They are not history at all. They are politics. When your prime ministers and home ministers tell you what history is to be written, it's politics. It's not history. Unfortunately, that is what is happening to our discipline. A lot of intervention, which is political intervention, motivated, it is not motivated towards writing a better, more understanding, a better understanding, more humane, more down to the people history. I wish that was the project.
And in fact, when you say it's politics, I guess one of the big things that the people who led the freedom movement had to push back on the idea was that the way British colonialism justified its presence in India was by saying that India is not really a nation at all, unlike the European countries which had one Catholic church, Protestant church, and one language. India was just too diverse, so it couldn't be a nation. So it must have required a certain audacity of vision to push back against and see that there was an Indian idea of an Indian nation.
Oh, absolutely. We have written about it. I mean, go horse shouting about it. That, India created the imagination of a nation which was revolutionary. It did not happen anywhere in the world. In the 19th century, when the British, as you were correctly saying, told us that how can you be a nation? You are only a geographical expression. They said India is a geographical expression. It cannot be a nation. Well, how can so many languages, so many religions, etc. be a nation? After all, in Europe, it was Catholic France, Protestant England, not even Christian France and England. So it was narrower. Unification of Italy, unification of Germany on the basis of one language. At that time, to imagine a nation which will celebrate diversity was, as you correctly say, it was not only audacious, it was fantastic, absolutely. But the thing is, it drew from this region's civilizational history, its capacity to live together, to incorporate. And that is what people like Nehru, starting with Nehru, then many other historians. In fact, Amartya Sen has built so many of his ideas of Indian history on Nehru. His argumentative Indian, talking about ancient Indian civilization being dialogical, is straight out of Nehru. So there was this enormous effort to bring the traditional civilizational value into the idea of a modern nationhood. And that was the great achievement of the Indian national movement. I mean, I remember about a decade ago, a team of European Union sort of intellectuals visited India with the specific purpose to try and see that how is it that India has remained a nation where we are having a difficulty in keeping Europe together even as a union with far less diversity, than India has. We cannot even agree on a common currency and we fight about our cheese and our wine and whatnot.
What did they find? Did they find the secret sauce?
I wouldn't know. But they came, they discussed. We had a lovely session where we said that what is it that makes it into a nation? And I'm sure they learned something from the Indian experience. It was an audacious experiment at creating a modern nation in this manner. And the world learned from it. For example, if you just Google South Africa, the first line that is written on top is unity in diversity. A phrase which has come straight out of Jawaharlal Nehru and the Indian effort, to create a nation out of diversity. And many parts of the world thought that it was a model. So when we go back to the 19th century European notion, which if you follow it through logically, only leads to Hitler's and Mussolini's, we are actually imposing on ourselves a foreign European notion of nationhood. One language, one Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. The nationalists would be squirming in their graves at the notion of a Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, That was not the Hindustan that any of our nationalist leaders imagined. Any, from Tilak to Vivekanand to Aurobindo, I'm naming their favorites, to certainly Gandhi, Nehru, and, Namudripad and Acharya Narendra Dev.
Well, before I let you go, Aditya Mukherjee, I have to ask you, you said you gave up history because of all the dates and kings you studied economics. What brought you back?
When I finished college, I did economics in St. Stephen's. And then this was the early 70s. The best of the Delhi School of Economics had left. Amartya Sen had left. Then from the left and from the right, people like Jagdish Bhagwati had left. And Delhi School became more and more, went into the direction of mathematical modeling. People was getting out of the economics that was being taught at that time, as it appeared to me. So I didn't want to do that. And those were days of unemployment. So one was looking for a job. So I got a job in selling soap for DCM. And at that time, the JNU started. And I looked at the faculty and the program that the history department in JNU put up. The faculty consisted of Sarvapalli Gopal, Ramila Thapar, Satish Chandra, Bipin Chandra, K.N. Panikkar, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, V.D. Chattopadhyay. It was an illustrious thing. And the courses were outstanding. There was no dates, no nothing. They had no problem of somebody who had never studied history to come in. I came in, my classmate, one of the faculty who joined faculty JNU later had done his MSc in chemistry. Another colleague of mine had done his BSc in physics and came into history, So it was a very different experience. And, as I said, that's when one learned that history was the master discipline. It's exciting. It's full of life.
Well, that story, I don't know if anything sums up unity in diversity than that story of your classroom. But thank you so much for joining us today, Aditya Mukherjee, and happy Independence Day in advance.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Aditya Mukherjee is Professor Emeritus of Contemporary Indian History at the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's the author of several books, including India's Struggle for Independence. He's also editor of the Sage Series in Modern Indian History, published by Sage Publications. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio, and happy Independence Day.